we have three very distinguished, in fact, I would even say superstar panelists for you. Stephen Biddle is the Senior Fellow for Defense Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. And he's an adjunct associate professor of international and public affairs at Columbia, doing yeoman work, teaching for us from time to time. His book, Military Power, Explaining Victory and Defeat in Modern Battle, is the absolute gold standard and focus of debate on that topic. And he's done wonderful service for the Saltzman Institute during the summertime when he's served with Dick Betts as the co-director of the summer workshop on the analysis of military operations and strategy, which is a terrifically successful institution that gives nitty-gritty, nuts and bolts military knowledge to academic specialists in international security affairs, many of whom have never served in the military themselves. Our second panelist is Max Boot, who's the Jeane Kirkpatrick Senior Fellow in National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's the author of a couple of very important recent books, War Made New, Technology, Warfare, and the Course of History, 1500 down to today, which appeared in 2006. And also the renowned book, The Savage Wars of Peace, Small Wars and the Rise of American Power, which was selected by the Washington Post and a slew of other places as one of the best books of the year 2002. Rounding out the panel, because Lieutenant Colonel Wilson had a bit of a logistical glitch in getting here this morning, and so could not make it. So rounding out the panel in his stead is Professor Richard Betts, who's the director of the Saltzman Institute and professor of international relations in the Columbia Political Science Department. He's the author of a whole stack of books, the most recent one of which is Enemies of Intelligence. So, Steve Biddle, please start us off.
Okay. I assume I should go up here, which has the interesting advantage of being lower than the podium, which I think is a first in talk giving. I'll take the bait and deal with three issues then. What would winning mean in Afghanistan? What are the odds of it happening? And given the odds and what it would mean and what it's worth, is it worth trying? Is this a war that we should wage, or would we be better off liquidating our involvement, disinvesting, and withdrawing from Afghanistan rather than doubling down and reinforcing, as the administration appears to have decided to do? And I'll start by taking a very orthodox Clausewitzian interpretation of what winning would mean. War is an attempt to secure political aims, so the key issue in what would winning mean is what are our aims? What goals are we pursuing here? And what then is the likelihood that we'll actually secure them? And I think there are two key sets of U.S. interests engaged in Afghanistan that the administration has already pointed to, which are not, to my view, equally compelling. The two interests that are widely pointed to for Afghanistan are, first of all, that Afghanistan not become a haven for attacking the United States, by al-Qaeda in particular, and secondly, that Afghanistan not become a haven for attacking anyone else, especially its neighbors, and especially Pakistan. And of those two, the second strikes me as much the more compelling. If we fail in Afghanistan and it becomes a Taliban version 2.0 controlled state, it could indeed become an al-Qaeda haven for attacking the United States, as it was the first time around, but so could Yemen, So could Somalia, so could Djibouti, so could the Philippines, so could Colombia, potentially. There are dozens of ill-governed, weak states around the world that in principle could become terrorist havens in which al-Qaeda could set up shop and from which al-Qaeda could strike the United States. Afghanistan isn't unique in that sense. In some respects, Afghanistan is a less advantageous base for striking the United States than some other places that have better transportation networks, are more interconnected with the global system, would be an easier base from which to organize an international terrorist operation, like, for instance, Pakistan. If our strategy for denying al-Qaeda prospective havens for striking the United States is to deploy multiple brigades of American ground forces and fight there for potentially a decade in order to prevent this, we are going to run out of brigades a long time before Osama bin Laden runs out of prospective havens. So whereas it is a reasonable concern that Afghanistan not be allowed to become a haven for attacking the United States, it strikes me that it is no more compelling than many other places and would not necessarily constitute a sufficient case for deploying the resource levels that we will need to deploy if we're going to succeed in Afghanistan. The unique argument for Afghanistan is that whereas there's in principle nothing particularly special about its ability to strike the United States, there is something quite special about its ability to destabilize Pakistan. It's right across the border. It is a unique prospective source of havens for insurgents to destabilize the government in Islamabad. And for many ways and in many respects, Pakistan is potentially a greater threat to U.S. interests than any other point on the planet. It is a weak state threatened by a major insurgency that could conceivably collapse and which has an existing nuclear weapons arsenal and is currently where al-Qaeda Global is based. If Pakistan were to collapse, and if it were to lose control over its nuclear arsenal, this is one of the few really plausible pathways by which Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda could get their hands on a usable weapon of mass destruction. This strikes me as a stake of truly grave scale to truly vital U.S. national security interests. The Pakistan problem, however, I would argue, is characterized by very limited U.S. leverage over outcomes. And in this sense, my position is much closer, I think, to Steve Call's than it is to Schumann's in the first panel this morning. For a variety of reasons, stemming both from serious questions of political division inside Pakistan and limited capacity of a divided Pakistani government to respond to incentives placed on it from outside, but also having to do with the strategic logic of the relationship between the United States and Pakistan internationally, I think there are very limited prospects for us to directly improve the stability of the Pakistani government. I'll cite just one. Our relative leverage over Pakistan is determined not just by the degree to which Pakistan values aid we could potentially provide, but by the degree to which the Pakistanis believe we need them in order to conduct a campaign in Afghanistan that we clearly value. Our ability to coerce the Pakistanis by threatening to withhold resources that we are now providing is limited by their knowledge that if we did that and caused the Pakistani government to fall, the effect on direct U.S. national security interests would be tremendously grave. There's a serious question about the degree to which Pakistani actors would read leverage of that kind as credible, even if the Pakistani government itself were able to respond, which I think is an equally serious problem. If you take the view that a central reality of the U.S. relationship with Pakistan is that we have some potential points of leverage, but at the end of the day, their efficacy is limited, and if you believe that outcomes in Pakistan are central to vital U.S. national security interests, we're stuck in a situation in which arguably the right thing to do is invoke the Hippocratic Oath, at least do no harm. If there's not a lot we can do to make the situation radically better, there is something we can do to make the situation radically worse. Actually, there's a variety of interesting ways we could make things worse. One of the more prominent of them, however, is to fail in Afghanistan. If the United States project in Afghanistan fails, and this government is taken over once more by the Taliban, it becomes potentially a state-scale haven for the use of Islamists who do not regard the Durand Line as particularly important to destabilize the government in Pakistan, and that could substantially increase the degree of threat to stable civilian government in Islamabad. That, it seems to me, is the primary U.S. stake in Afghanistan. And I think that is a consequential and substantial stake. The odds that Pakistan will collapse, the odds that they will lose control of their nuclear arsenal, the odds that this will eventually fall into al-Qaeda's hands are in no case 100%, but none of these outcomes can be excluded. The odds at every step of the way go up in the event that Afghanistan collapses, and the scale of the consequences to the United States if this chain of events should come to be is quite serious. Now, even if you believe that that's a low probability outcome, the gravity of the consequences if it occurs is quite severe, and the United States has in the past, as in, for example, the entirety of the Cold War, been willing to exert substantial effort to take relatively unlikely events that have really grave consequences and make them substantially less likely still. And it seems to me that analysis pertains to Afghanistan as well. So I think there are important U.S. interests engaged in Afghanistan. Winning means denying the use of the country secondarily as a platform for attacking us, primarily as a platform for attacking Pakistan. And those interests are serious enough that they motivate the conduct of war in Afghanistan to pursue them if that conduct of war can succeed. Which brings me to the second question that Jack raised earlier. Is there a reasonable prospect that through U.S. activity we can, in fact, deny the use of Afghanistan as a haven for either of these two projects? And let no one think that that's an easy prospect. Ike Wilson, who I gather is still trying to extricate himself from an automobile accident, has argued that in the modern era, the rate of great power success in counterinsurgency is on the order of 25%. One can quibble with the particular success rate. One can't quibble with the difficulty of the undertaking. For a variety of reasons, counterinsurgency is hard. And for a variety of reasons, success in counterinsurgency can never be guaranteed. On the other hand, neither can failure be guaranteed. There are many analogies that have been raised many, many times already in the debate over Afghanistan, both to the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, to the United States experience in Vietnam, to the British experience in Afghanistan, that I think tell one side of the story, but only one side of the story. Let me sketch a couple of reasons by which one might suppose that the prospects in Afghanistan are not zero, that there is at least the historical success probability confronting us in Afghanistan, and that possibly the prospects for the effort in Afghanistan might be better than the historical average. And I think they pertain both to some advantages that we bring to this conflict and some disadvantages that our enemies bring to this conflict. First of all, and especially by contrast, for example, with the Soviets in Afghanistan, I would submit that the United States military in 2009 is possibly the most capable state counterinsurgent organization that we have seen in modern military history. There are many imperfections with it, as there are with all military instruments for all purposes. The U.S. military was not very good at this at all in 2003, but we've learned a lot in the School of Hard Knocks about how to conduct counterinsurgency as a result of the tortured history of our involvement in Iraq. And we now have a combination of a stated military doctrine for the conduct of counterinsurgency that I think is unusually strong as a statement of a military approach to waging this kind of conflict, and we have an instrument for carrying it out which has been doing nothing else ever since about 2004. And I would submit has now become pretty proficient at it at an individual and a unit level. So we begin with, by contrast with the Soviet Union, for example, which, to put it mildly, did not adopt a win hearts and minds to prevail over the political alignment of the majority of the population approach to counterinsurgency when they were involved in Afghanistan, whereas we now adopt that, I believe, historically orthodox approach to the waging of this kind of war. By contrast with the Soviets in Afghanistan, I think we begin with a much stronger instrument being directed by a much sounder doctrine, and those are important advantages. Secondly, an important part of counterinsurgency doctrine is the importance of establishing legitimacy on the part of the host nation government. One of the flaws, arguably, of the written doctrine we now have is that it tends to assume that the host government wants that as much as we do. One of the advantages that I think the new administration has going into the conduct of a counterinsurgency is the new administration is inclined to believe that it's important that the United States exert leverage where it can, very limited in Pakistan, but potentially more important in Afghanistan. And I think that leverage gives the United States potential to bring about governance reform in Afghanistan to a substantially greater degree than previous administrations in Afghanistan or previous states that have tried counterinsurgency in this country have done. Whereas the Bush administration tended to believe that Hamid Karzai was our ally, you don't coerce your allies, how can we be mean towards someone who shares our goals and is trying to advance our cause like his cause? I think this administration understands that there is an interest divergence between ourselves and the government of Afghanistan. They believe that it's important that the government of Afghanistan move in the direction we want them to move by, for example, limiting corruption, and especially by limiting the role of narcotics corruption in governance in Afghanistan, and they are prepared to use coercive leverage to move the Karzai government in this direction. And I think that's an important advantage and an important change in the way the war will be conducted in the future over the way the war has been conducted in the past. There are also some important issues on the other side, however. In many ways, the Taliban are not the Viet Cong. This is an opponent that has important limitations and shortcomings of its own that we need to take into account when we assess what the prospects for this campaign are. And it seems to me that the Taliban face three very important disadvantages in their conduct of this campaign. The first is lack of unity of command. Many of us are impressed by how difficult it is for the United States to wage counterinsurgency in Afghanistan because we're stuck with a NATO command structure that creates a wiring diagram that looks like a bowl of spaghetti and that makes common action and unity of effort very difficult. Well, it's not like the Taliban are free from similar problems. And in some ways, their problems of unity of command are even harder than ours. We refer to them as the Taliban, which implies that it's a single actor and a single entity, and it is neither of those things. The Taliban is a coalition of very dissimilar actors with very dissimilar and sometimes conflicting interests and very little ability to coordinate their activities, in part because they don't necessarily trust one another, and they don't necessarily trust that they're all pursuing the same ends. What that means is it's very, very difficult for the Taliban as an entity to produce the degree of interfactional cooperation that's required in order to undertake major military projects like, for example, the capture of a defended city, that would require the military resources of more than one factional element of this broad coalition. So the first serious problem that the Taliban faces is that they're disunified, and potentially quite profoundly so, and in ways that we can and should exploit. The second problem that the Taliban face is ideological. The Viet Cong in Vietnam had the great example, or the great advantage, that what they were selling is something that hadn't been previously tried. And thus, as an ideal on the horizon, it looked appealing and attractive and could command a degree of allegiance from a population whose allegiance was up in the air. A serious problem that the Taliban face in Afghanistan today is people know what they're selling, and they don't like what they're selling. Every poll I've ever seen for Afghanistan suggests that less than 10% of the population wants Taliban governance, and they have a pretty good sense of what that means, having tried it before. Now, the Taliban are trying very hard now to re-engineer themselves politically and ideologically to improve their appeal in Afghanistan, but they're laboring uphill against a very clear perception on the part of the population they're trying to influence of what they stand for and how they would rule if they got control of the country again. And their rule and their governing platform is radically unpopular. That's an important advantage for us. It creates a substantial presumption in favor of the government of Afghanistan if it could be reformed to the point where it could deliver services administratively in an effective way. The third disadvantage that the Taliban have in Afghanistan is that they're an ethnically constrained movement. Not all Pashtuns are Taliban, but almost all Taliban are Pashtuns. The Pashtuns are a major force in southern and eastern Afghanistan. They are radically less so in northern and western Afghanistan. And what that does is it creates very serious challenges for the Taliban in extending their control across the entirety of the country. And in particular, it's worth noting that even in the first time around, the Taliban failed to exert their control over the entirety of Afghanistan even then. The Northern Alliance maintained a contiguous control of something like 10 or 15% of the land area of the country, even in 2001. And in fact, it was that Northern Alliance enclave in the northeastern part of the country that enabled us to get back into the country and eventually topple the Taliban regime. So the Taliban have important limitations. We have important advantages relative to prior counterinsurgents. Where does that leave us? And I think what it leaves us is in a condition in which the case for making a go of this is, I think, stronger on the merits than the case for liquidating our position and withdrawing. But I think it's relatively close on the merits. In my view, this may not be quite a 51-49 call, but it's fairly close. And the problem here is, A, even though we have advantages and the Taliban has disadvantages, the global difficulty of the undertaking is quite severe. If the average success rate in counterinsurgency is 25%, ours is probably higher, 50%, 60%. There's a substantial chance that even in exchange for a long, expensive, fraught military effort, it could still fail even if it's done right. Secondly, the primary case for why it's worthwhile in terms of the U.S. interests engaged here is indirect and incomplete. If our primary need to be in Afghanistan is Pakistan, we could conceivably succeed in Afghanistan, and the government in Islamabad could still fall for reasons that are internal to Pakistan. On balance, the severity of the risk to U.S. interests associated with the possibility that the chain of events unfolds and bin Laden gets his hands on a Pakistani nuclear weapon is severe enough that I think, at the margin, a complicated, uncertain, difficult war effort is worth trying because the scale of the consequences, if we fail, are so severe. But I think on the merits, there's an argument to be made on either side of this because of the difficulty of the undertaking inherently and because of the indirect, although important, nature of the U.S. interests involved. I think that's going to make this a politically very, very challenging public management job for the Obama administration in maintaining public support for a war effort that's a relatively close call on the margins through what's going to be a long effort involving multiple budget cycles in which the need to justify this war will come up again and again and again. Barack Obama is a perhaps uniquely talented political communicator. This war effort, although I think he's right on the merits, will be a perhaps uniquely difficult challenge for his political communications skills. And I'll stop there.